Hello, my name is Joeri Rogelj and I'm a reader in climate science and policy at Imperial College in London. I study the ways in which we can change our global society to limit global warming and achieve sustainable development. Today I will look with you at the actions countries should take to be in line with the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was adopted by over 190 countries in the French capital in 2015 and sets a long-term temperature goal for global warming. That goal is that global warming should be kept well below 2 degrees and efforts should be pursued to limit it to 1.5. Countries also highlighted that this would significantly reduce the risks and impacts of climate change. The Paris Agreement covers all important greenhouse gas emissions that are the result of human activities, including carbon dioxide, and that is mainly the result of burning fossil fuels and deforestation, methane and nitrous oxide that are mostly caused by agriculture, and also other greenhouse gases with smaller warming contributions. The question now becomes, what should we do to keep warming well below 2 degrees or even 1.5? The latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, has clearly established that every ton of carbon dioxide, or CO2, that is added to the atmosphere adds to global warming. So to keep global warming to a specific temperature limit, the total amount of carbon dioxide that is ever emitted needs to be kept within a finite carbon budget. Over the past 2 centuries, industrial activities and deforestation have already resulted in around 2,500 billion tons of CO2 being emitted. To limit warming to 1.5 degrees with a 1 in 2 chance, the world as a whole can only emit 500 billion tons more from today. To have a 2 in 3 chance, this is even less. Having such a carbon budget comes with a couple clear implications. First, halting warming always requires that we reach net zero CO2 emissions. In other words, we have to stop using the atmosphere as a waste bin. It also means that delaying climate action now comes with consequences. We will need to reduce emissions more steeply in the future to stay within the same carbon budget. And lastly, if we exceed the carbon budget, we end up with more warming than we would consider safe. To stay within a carbon budget, global greenhouse gas emissions need to decline. And the pathways to keep warming well below 2 degrees or 1.5 always use a combination of strategies to achieve this. First, they combine deep reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions, shown in orange here, with a certain amount of carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, shown in gray in this figure. And they do so to ensure that the amount of CO2 that is released into the atmosphere is as low as possible. Once we reach net zero CO2 emissions, we would stop global warming from further increasing. If we go even further and remove more CO2 than we emit, we can try and slowly reverse some of the warming that our historical emissions have caused. However, not all the impacts are reversible. For example, once a species has gone extinct, it won't come back if the planet cools down again. It is therefore important to keep warming as low as we possibly can. Finally, the Paris Agreement covers more greenhouse gases than just CO2. And in one of its articles, it states that all greenhouse gas emissions combined need to reach net zero in the second half of this century. Also, to achieve this last target of the Paris Agreement, reductions in CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gases have to be combined with a certain amount of carbon dioxide removal. What are these carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, approaches? They are sometimes also known as negative emissions technologies and are a very varied bunch, with some being very familiar to us, such as reforestation or the management of soils to take up more carbon, while others are more technical, combining bioenergy with carbon capture and storage to store carbon underground, which is called BECCS, or to capture CO2 with chemical filters directly from the air. I don't have time to discuss each option that exists, But it is important to note that the use of CDR or of specific CDR measures can come with important risks or trade-offs. The most important aspect of climate change mitigation is that emissions should decline. And the hope that CDR can remove CO2 from the atmosphere many years from now in the future should not be a reason to delay action today. The second risk is that some of these technologies are still in their initial stages and are expensive. We don't know yet if and how successful they will be in scaling up. A third risk lies also in the approaches that we actually understand quite well, such as reforestation or afforestation. The carbon that we store in plants and soils might not be removed permanently, and wildfires or other climatic disturbances could cause these carbon emissions to be released again into the atmosphere, where they will again cause warming. And finally, many of these approaches use a lot of land, water, nutrients, and can therefore compete with food production, affect water availability, or compete with biodiversity. And that is why not all pathways that limit warming to 1.5 are created equal. Here I show 4 pathways, and 3 of those are compatible with limiting warming close to 1.5 degrees. The gray area in this figure shows the emissions from fossil fuels and industry. The brown area, the emissions from agriculture and forestry, and they are labeled with the acronym AFOLU. And the yellow area show the potential contribution of technical carbon dioxide removal, such as the bioenergy combined with carbon capture and storage, labeled with BECCS. And you can see that all 3 pathways reach net zero emissions, but you can also see that they do so very differently. Some rely on a lot of carbon dioxide removal, while others much more strongly reduce emissions and use much less carbon dioxide removal. Ultimately, the timing and scale of carbon dioxide removal depends on how deeply we reduce emissions over the near term, the mitigation strategy that is followed, or how much risk of failure we are comfortable with to accept. This affects the scale and the type of technologies that we consider. And finally, once we have reached net zero, the timing and scale of carbon dioxide removal also depend on the desired rate of temperature decline after the peak. That is when we would reach net negative emissions. Now that we understand what needs to be done to limit warming to 1.5 and 2 degrees, let's have a look at how countries are doing. Climate pledges of all 190 plus countries under the Paris Agreement, also known as the Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs. As of the 30th of July of this year, 2021, covered around 93% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. They do not include international aviation or international shipping. Under the Paris Agreement, the pledges of countries are not legally binding. Countries pledge, but whether they are held accountable differs from country to country. In some countries, the pledge has become part of their national law, but in others, it is merely an ambition or a guideline. To understand what current country pledges add up to, I will draw on the analysis of the annual emissions gap report of the United Nations Environment Programme. Each year, these reports show where emissions should be going to limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees and where they are heading based on our current policies. So let's have a look at this figure. It shows global greenhouse gas emissions between now and 2030. And at the bottom of the figure, in the green colors, we see how pathways that limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees strongly reduce their emissions over the next decade. For example, pathways that limit warming close to 1.5 show roughly a halving of global emissions by 2030 compared to the year 2010. They reach net zero CO2 emissions around mid-century, around 2050. And they then reach net zero global greenhouse gas emissions about 2 decades later, around 2070. At the top of this figure, we see where emissions would have been heading if we had no improvements in policies since 2010. That is shown in gray. And below that, it is shown how much the policies that are currently on the books and are being implemented are lowering this in blue, the current policy scenarios. This picture clearly shows that current policies do not yet set us on a path to keeping warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees. If we now further look at the pledges that countries have made, here shown in orange and red, we see that also these promises would not yet reduce emissions down to where they have to be. This means that currently there is an important gap between the emissions reductions that countries are pledging and the reductions that we need to see globally to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. In addition, there is also a gap between what countries have promised and what they are actually doing in terms of policies on the ground. A last aspect that I would like to discuss is the role of fossil fuel subsidies in pathways consistent with the Paris Agreement. Fossil fuel subsidies are support by governments for the exploration, extraction, or consumption of fossil fuels, which makes the price of fossil fuels lower than it should be. For example, countries can support fossil fuel companies in their exploration efforts for new fossil fuels. They can support citizens buying fossil fuels by artificially lowering the price of petrol at the pump, or they can simply disregard the fact that burning fossil fuels is causing climate change and results in damages to the planet and our societies around the globe. The costs of these damages are typically also shouldered by public money and therefore a hidden subsidy. Pathways that are in line with the Paris Agreement strongly reduce emissions and need to drastically scale up low-carbon energy sources such as solar and wind power to achieve this. Meanwhile, fossil fuels have to be phased out. Subsidies frustrate the societal transformation and are therefore not compatible with the needed low-carbon transformation. With the evidence I've provided here, I hope it is clear that keeping global warming to the safe levels of the Paris Agreement is a huge challenge, and we are still very far from meeting it.